travel deep beneath the blue mountains, where time sleeps in stone and memory lingers like lantern smoke. As you breathe slowly, in and out, let your thoughts fall quiet. Let the sound of falling dust and crackling forge fire carry you to a place forgotten by most, but not by all. The mountain breathed. Borin, son of Thorlin, knew the sound well. Not wind, but the creaking sigh of stone shifting ever so slightly, as if adjusting itself beneath centuries of weight. It was an old sound, and not one to fear, unless it came twice. The second groan echoed down the narrow tunnel, just as Borin lifted his lantern. The walls shuddered, and that was when the ceiling came down. He dove. Stone crashed behind him in a spray of dust and sound. When it cleared, the tunnel was sealed tight as a tomb. He coughed, spitting grit from his beard, and checked his legs. Bruised but not broken. His back ached, always did. But he was alive. By Durin's boots, he muttered. The lantern had fallen near his feet, still glowing with its soft yellow flame. Borin picked it up and turned to face the collapsed wall. Then he saw it, a crack. Not the sort of crack caused by a cave-in. This was deliberate, straight, clean, and lined with a kind of mossy growth he didn't recognize. And behind it, something gleamed. He narrowed his eyes. Borin wasn't a treasure hunter. He was a stone worker. He shaped archways and lifted lintels, built tunnels for mainers who didn't care for beauty, only safety. But this was different. He ran his fingers along the seam. It wasn't dwarvish work, and yet he felt drawn to it. He returned the next morning with tools, no other dwarves. This was his tunnel, and if it was unsafe, he'd be the one to judge it. Besides, he didn't want talk just yet. Something about this place felt quiet. Sacred even, it took hours to open the hidden doorway. The moss burned slightly when scraped away, releasing a faint scent like memory. Sweet but distant, like old parchment or lavender on a pillow that hadn't been touched in years. And then, with a groan like breath held too long, the wall opened. Inside was a small chamber, no wider than a cart, carved smooth with no markings on the walls. No dust, no air stirring, just a pedestal, and on it a sword. It was slender, long, and straight. Elvish, clearly. Its blade was moon pale, with no sign of rust or time. The hilt bore leaves carved in silver and wrapped with black and gold wire, so fine it looked spun by spiders. A single gem, milky blue, rested in its pommel, and it glowed faintly. No flame, no enchantment he could feel. Just light, like starlight folded into metal. Borin stared at it for a long time. He was no lover of elven things, too delicate, too pretty. But But this sword didn't feel pretty. It felt lonely. He reached out and touched the hilt. Nothing happened. No vision, no lightning, no curse. Just a soft warmth in the handle, like a hand that hadn't been held in too long. "I'll not be keeping you," he muttered aloud, as if to assure the mountain and himself. "Just moving you." He wrapped it carefully in cloth and placed it in his pack. That night, back in his forge, Borin couldn't sleep. He'd placed the sword on his workbench beside an old lantern and a bowl of water for quenching hot metal. The forge fire had long gone out, and only embers remained, but the sword still glowed softly. He lay on his cot, eyes half shut, beard tucked into his collar as he always did. But something stirred, a breeze, in a forge with no windows, and then a whisper, not loud, not angry, just a name, one he didn't know. Elioneth. Borin sat upright. The forge was empty. The embers crackled, and the sword still glowed. He stared at it for a long time, then swung his legs over the side of the cot and stood. "All right," he said aloud, rubbing his hands together. "If you've got something to say, speak it." Silence. "Then you found it." The voice wasn't in the room. It was in his chest, and somewhere beyond the forge, beyond the mountain, beyond the waking world, something stirred, something that had been waiting. The sword that sang. The next morning, Borin tried to forget the voice. He poured water on the forge's embers, ground fresh coffee beans with a well-worn crank, and kept his back turned to the bench where the sword still rested, wrapped in linen. It hadn't moved, hadn't glowed, hadn't whispered anything else, and yet the forge felt different, warmer, more awake. He grunted and got to work, hammering out a support bracket for a stairwell near the mine shaft. Dull work, satisfying. But every time the hammer struck steel, the sound shifted, like an echo beneath the clang, a hum he couldn't place. It wasn't until the third strike that he froze, because the hum was melodic. He set the hammer down and listened. The air was still, but faintly, very faintly, he could hear it. A single note. Long, steady, not from any instrument. Coming from the sword. He unwrapped it carefully, as though disturbing a bird's nest. The blade gleamed in the forge light, untouched by soot or dust. The humming continued, low and soft, like a lullaby hummed in another room. He tilted his head. The note changed. It became a chord, gentle, layered, almost too complex to follow, like wind moving through crystal, or a distant choir beneath a mountain lake, and beneath that, a whisper, Elioneth. Borin sat on his stool and crossed his arms. "All right, lad," he muttered, "you've got a story. best speak it plain. The forge grew still. The sword quieted, and then, softly, as if afraid to disturb the air, a voice spoke, not aloud, not outside, but within. It sang once, the voice said. When Gondolin still stood, Borin blinked. You're the one from my dream, a pause. I was never gone, just waiting. Waiting for what? For someone to touch the blade who would not wield it. That struck him. He wasn't sure why, but it made his breath catch. He looked down at the sword again. Its glow had faded slightly, not dimmed, just calmed. He picked it up with both hands, not like a weapon, like a memory. Who are you? Borin asked quietly. The voice came softer now. My name was Elioneth. I was of the House of the Fountain. I fell in the burning of Gondolin, but I did not pass. The blade pulsed once in his hands, almost like a heartbeat. The sword remained, so did I. Borin didn't speak for a while. There was something sacred here, and he wasn't used to sacred things. He had shaped stone, carried coal, buried friends, built halls. But this was something out of the old stories, and it had come to his forge. To him, that night he didn't sleep much. He sat beside the sword, oiling its hilt, turning it gently in the firelight. It didn't hum again, but he thought he heard music when he closed his eyes, the sound of a waterfall striking marble, the echo of Elvish voices beneath silver banners, and beneath it all, a song carried on the wind, a name, a sorrow, and a promise. The visitor at the forge. The third night came with heavy rain. It pattered softly against the forge's slate roof, a rhythm steady enough to quiet Borin's thoughts. He sat near the fire again, the sword laid across his lap, the lantern dimmed low beside it. He hadn't spoken to anyone about the blade, not even old Auric, who liked to stop by with bread and complaints. This felt private, sacred, and though the sword had not sung again, it felt as though something inside it was listening. The forge had taken on a new stillness, not hollow, not cold, just attentive, like a breath waiting to be exhaled. Then, sometime past midnight, Borin looked up. He didn't hear a footstep or a creak, but there, in the far corner of the forge, just beyond the firelight, a figure stood, tall, slim, draped in a cloak darker than the stone behind it, soaked from the rain, yet leaving no puddle on the floor. The hood was drawn low. Borin reached instinctively for his hammer, but the figure raised a hand, slow, gentle, not a threat, a greeting or a remembering. The dwarf stood slowly. I've seen you, he said, in dreams. The figure stepped forward into the glow of the fire. He was pale, paler than moonlight, with silver hair that hung like river threads. His face was ageless, and yet there was age in it, a sorrow too deep for any wound. "Elioneth?" Borin asked. The elf nodded once, but his voice came not with grandeur or command. It was soft, like the sigh of leaves in autumn. You heard the blade sing. "That's why I could come." Borin didn't move, didn't speak for a moment. Elves didn't come to dwarven forges. Not now, not ever. Especially not ones who hadn't walked the world in an age. "How are you here?" Borin asked, voice hushed. Elioneth looked down at the blade. "I was bound to it," he said, "not by spell, not by curse, but by choice." He knelt beside the forged stones, resting on one knee. "I died holding that sword, but my memory lived on in it, waiting, hoping that someone might listen, not to use it, but to understand it." The dwarf swallowed. "I'm no elf friend. Never studied your runes. I've carved halls, not songs." Elioneth smiled faintly. "But you listened anyway. That's all the blade ever needed." They sat in silence for a long while. The fire crackled, the rain continued, and the sword lay between them, glowing slightly now, as if warmed by the company. Elioneth reached out, but didn't touch it. "I forged it for my brother," he said, quietly. "He never held it. Gondolin fell before he returned." Borin exhaled. "Gondolin? That's more than a name in a book, then." Elioneth's gaze drifted toward the flames. "I was there when the walls cracked, when dragons came, when towers fell. I stayed to fight, but in the end, I only watched everything I loved burn. Except the sword." He looked at Borin. "Do you understand what it means to bury a city with your silence?" Borin nodded once. "I've buried more than stone." That night they didn't speak much more, but the forge held them both, one living, one lingering. And when dawn came, Elioneth was gone. No footprints, no door opened, only the sword remained, still humming a note low and deep beneath the waking world. Gondolin remembered. Elioneth returned with the stars. Borin had left the sword unwrapped on the bench, waiting. He didn't know why. Maybe some part of him had known the elf would come again, because the blade had started humming as the sun set, the same long, slow note like breath held beneath water. The elf stood in the doorway without a sound, moonlight catching in his silver hair. "Will you sit?" Borin asked without turning. "I would," Elioneth answered, "and this time I will speak." They sat again by the coals. The sword lay between them, quiet now, as if listening. Elioneth rested his hands on his knees, his gaze distant. "Gondolin was hidden," he began. "A city of white stone, born of starlight and song, cradled in the mountains. Turgon built it with the dream of peace, a last light against the shadow. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. Not louder, but deeper, rooted in something older than words. I was not a warrior, not then. I carved designs into marble. I studied music. I sang beside fountains. That was my world, until Morgoth found us. Borin listened in stillness. Elioneth continued, eyes unfocused, voice full of snow and fire. They came on dragonback, and with fire beneath their feet. Balrogs, orcs, shadow made flesh, the mountains broke, the sky turned red. We fought, but the city bled. My brothers fell one by one. The great gates cracked open. The fountains ran dry. He drew a slow breath, and I ran. Another pause. Not shameful. Just quiet. I ran with the children. I carried one on my back. I gave the sword to another to defend them, but he fell. I returned for the blade, not to fight, to remember. He touched the hilt lightly, and then I died, holding it, not from wounds, from grief. Borin stirred the fire with a piece of charcoal. And you stayed, he murmured. Elioneth nodded, because I could not bear to leave it behind. The sword was never made to kill. It was a gift, a song set in steel. My brother's name is carved into the tang, hidden so that only someone who listened would find it. He looked at Borin. You heard it. The dwarf said nothing, only stared at the flames. Why me? He finally whispered. You asked nothing of it, Elioneth said. You lifted it with care. You didn't call it yours. The forge grew still. Again, then Elioneth stood. I must return soon. Dawn pulls me back. To where? The elf smiled faintly. To silence. Until the blade is returned to the song. Borin blinked. What song? Elioneth's eyes shimmered in the firelight. The one beneath the mountains. Deeper than stone. Where the roots remember what the leaves forget. He bowed slightly, his form already fading. I will show you the way, when you are ready. And then he was gone. Borin didn't sleep that night. He sat beside the sword, listened and wept for a city he had never seen, and a song he had never known he'd heard. A dwarf who listens. Borin had not left the forge in 2 days. Not for ale, not for the mines, not even for the warmth of the hearth down the hall, where his brothers played quiet dice games by firelight. He remained with the blade. It did not hum this time. It waited, and so did he. When Elioneth appeared again, just before midnight, he looked different. Not weaker, not stronger, just more present, as though the boundary between his fading soul and the world had grown thinner. The elf didn't speak at first. He sat beside the forge and reached out to touch the stone floor, fingers splayed wide. murmured. "The mountain is listening now." Borin sat across from him, hammer in hand, though he wasn't using it. "I've been listening too," the dwarf said, "to things I never thought I'd believe." He rubbed his thumb along the worn handle of his tool. "I always thought stories were for the halls, for younglings." "They are," Elioneth replied, "but the oldest ones are for the ones who've seen too much to believe easily." Borin nodded. "And yet, I believe you." Elioneth smiled softly. "Because you listen. Most only hear." They sat for a long while, not talking, just sharing the space. The mountain groaned once, deep and slow, not in danger, just shifting, like an old friend rolling over in sleep. Then Borin stood and walked to his bench. He picked up the sword with both hands. "I don't want to carry it," he said quietly, "but I will, if that's what it needs." Elioneth rose beside him. "There's a place beneath the mountain," he said, "not marked on your maps, not on mine either, but it's there. A chamber where the oldest roots touch stone. That's where it must go." Borin looked up. "What happens when we reach it?" "I'll know," Elioneth said, and though his voice was steady, his eyes shimmered like dew in moonlight. That night, Elioneth did not fade. He stayed. He spoke little, but he helped Borin pack soft cloth for the sword, oil for their lamps, travel bread and dried mushrooms, a charm or two from the old shrine near the upper shaft, and when they finished, they sat together by the fire. Two figures, one solid, one woven from memory, but both warm in the glow. "Do you ever wish you had left?" Borin asked softly. Elioneth stared into the flames. "Sometimes," he said, "but I was never meant for Valinor." "Why?" "Because I am not ready to stop remembering." Borin leaned back against the wall. The stone was warm, not from fire, from something deeper, older, listening. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, just to rest, and he whispered, softly, so the forge would hear, "I'll take him home." The unspoken grudge. The tunnel sloped beneath the old forges, past the last lanterns, past the sound of pickaxes, past even the memory of dwarves who once sang as they mined. Borin walked first. Elioneth followed, his presence dimmer now, but steadier, no longer flickering like a candle, but flowing like mist around stone. The sword, wrapped in velvet, was tied across Borin's back. The further they descended, the quieter it became. Even their footsteps stopped echoing. It was as though the rock around them had grown soft, listening perhaps, or holding its breath. They paused at a carved threshold. The stone here bore no names, no runes, only a single mark, etched so faintly it took Borin's fingers to feel it. its root. He turned to Elioneth. "What is this place?" The elf touched the wall. "This was once a meeting place," he whispered. "Dwarves and elves. In the early days, before grief buried the friendship." Borin raised a brow. "Didn't think we ever had much of one." Elioneth half smiled. "That's what grief does. It makes you forget the warmth and remember only the wound." They stepped inside. The chamber was circular, carved smooth and deep. Benches ran along the walls, and in the center lay a stone basin, empty but once filled with water, judging by the way the floor had worn into soft rings. It felt like a place made for voices, though no voice had touched it in centuries. As they entered, the air changed, not colder, but heavier, like a hush falling just before a name is spoken. Borin adjusted the blade on his back, and the whisper came, not from Elioneth, not from the tunnel behind, but from the stone. "Why have you brought him?" Borin froze. Elioneth did not. He stepped forward, hands open, because he listened. The whisper came again, this time clearer, not cruel, not angry, but old, and filled with hurt. We remember the silence that followed the screams. Borin looked around, and then he saw it. In the stone wall, a figure began to emerge, not stepping forward, but forming from the very rock itself. A face, broad, bearded, dwarven, but with eyes closed, and yet it spoke. "You come with elf song on your breath. You bring what was buried." Borin stepped forward slowly. "I bring it not to claim," he said, "but to return." The stone being's eyes opened. They were not eyes of fire. They were the color of deep stone and quiet water. "And yet you walk beside the one who sang as we fell." Elioneth lowered his head. "I sang," he said quietly, "but I also stayed." The chamber trembled, only slightly, not a threat, a shiver, a memory. "You carry the sound of Gondolin's end." Elioneth nodded. "Because I was there." "Then speak its name, and be judged." The forge inside Borin's chest ached. He didn't know if it was fear or something more ancient. Elioneth stepped forward. He placed his hand on the stone basin and spoke, not in Elvish, but in Westron, slow and clear. "I am Elioneth of the Fountain. I forged no weapon that slew your kin, but I stayed behind when the towers fell. I carried the name of the blade, not to war, but to mourning." A long pause followed, and then the stone figure closed its eyes and sighed. "Then carry it now, and go. The roots remember you." The presence faded. The chamber warmed, and the air began to move again. Not much, just enough for Borin to breathe. He turned to Elioneth. "That was something." The elf smiled faintly. "That was forgiveness, or something like it." They left the chamber in silence, but the mountain around them had changed. It no longer waited. It welcomed. Echoes in the deep. The tunnels had grown so narrow that Borin had to duck. Even Elioneth walked with his head low, his tall frame shadowed in the dim amber light of Borin's lantern. The sword, still wrapped, no longer glowed, but it felt heavier now, as if it sensed the nearness of something it had waited for too long. They had passed carvings in the walls, faint and half consumed by time. Trees, stars, a sun with no face. Elvish and dwarvish symbols woven together like roots around stone. Neither of them spoke much now. They were deep enough that the air was cold, damp, and still, the kind of stillness that made you whisper without meaning to. Then Elioneth slowed. "We're near," he murmured. Borin stopped. "You remember this place?" Elioneth shook his head. "No, but the blade does." A bend in the tunnel opened to a vast chamber, not carved, but grown, as if the mountain had shaped it of its own will. The floor was smooth obsidian. The walls rose high into unseen darkness, etched with pale green veins that pulse faintly, like the glow of deep living roots. In the center, a low stone platform rested, silent, waiting. Borin stepped in, and everything changed. The lantern dimmed, the air thickened, and a hum began, not from the sword, not from Elioneth, but from the mountain itself. A deep vibration that ran through the soles of his boots, into his bones. Then a breath, a real one, not wind, not air shifting, a breath rising from the deep below. Borin turned slowly, and there it was, a shape enormous, curled in the far corner of the chamber, half hidden in stone, not sleeping, listening. It was not dragon, nor beast, nor machine. It was a being made of root and memory, woven of moss and silence. Its eyes were closed, but its chest rose slowly with every breath, and as they stepped closer, it spoke, not aloud. "Inside them, you have come at last." Borin nearly dropped the sword, but Elioneth stepped forward, head bowed. "We bring what was lost." The being shifted slightly. Stone groaned, not in pain, in age. The blade has wandered, but it was never meant to be carried, only remembered. Borin stepped beside Elioneth. He removed the cloth from the sword, and as the bare metal touched the air, it shimmered. Not with firelight, with memory. Visions spilled into the chamber like mist. Gondolin's towers gleaming in the morning sun. A child holding the sword too wide for his hands. A song sung by fountains. A final stand at a broken gate. Elioneth kneeling, the sword across his lap. A dwarf lifting it and listening, the being's eyes opened, vast, ageless, and green as the first spring. "Return it." Elioneth stepped to the platform. With reverence, he laid the blade across the stone and stepped back. The chamber held its breath. The sword pulsed once and then went still. The roots around the walls glowed brighter. The green veins shimmered like starlight soaked in moss, and the being, whatever it was, exhaled. You have ended the silence. Elioneth's form began to fade, but not as before. This was not a ghost slipping from sight. This was completion. His outline grew soft. Light pooled in his chest, silver and gentle. He turned to Borin, his voice calm and whole. "This is my last moment." Borin stepped forward. "But what happens now?" Elioneth smiled. "Now I sleep." And the song continues. He raised a hand, not in farewell, but in blessing. "You listened, Borin." That was all the world ever asked. And with that, he was gone. The sword remained, but it no longer glowed. It rested like stone, warmed by deep fire. Borin stood in the silence and wept, not from grief, but from the weight of peace. The guardian below. Borin stayed. He did not know for how long. Tame had melted away inside the deep chamber, and the fire in his lantern had gone cold without him noticing. But he was not cold. The air, though damp and ancient, felt warm on his skin, like a blanket left out in the sun. The sword still lay where Elioneth had placed it, but it no longer pulsed. It no longer hummed. It simply rested, complete. Across the chamber, the guardian, half root, half stone, remained unmoving. Eyes closed now, chest rising, slowly, but Borin felt no fear. He had seen dragons in his youth, faced cave-ins, lost kin. This did not feel like danger. It felt like sitting beside a sleeping giant who had finally stopped dreaming of war. He sat at the edge of the platform, cross-legged, hands resting on his knees. "I'm not one for ceremony," Borin said softly, speaking more to the stone than to himself. "But thank you for letting us in, for letting him go." The chamber did not echo. It absorbed his words like soil takes rain. Then the guardian opened one eye, green and soft, not glowing, just alive. "You stayed," Borin blinked. Why?" He hesitated, then shrugged. Didn't seem right to leave him alone. Not after all that. The guardian regarded him for a long moment, then said, "Few of your kind sit beside memory. Fewer still without asking something from it." "I didn't come for treasure," Borin muttered. "Didn't even come for the sword. Just found it." And it started talking. The guardian's chest rose and fell again, slower now, more peaceful. You heard it, but more importantly, you listened. They sat together in silence. Borin leaned back on his elbows. The ceiling above stretched into blackness, but it didn't feel oppressive. It felt vast. He looked up and whispered, "Will the sword stay here forever?" "Until the mountain forgets," the guardian replied, "and the mountain forgets nothing." That comforted Borin more than he expected. He looked down at his calloused hands. "I thought I'd live and die carving stone, building stairways no one thanked me for." He paused. "But now, I'll remember this." The guardian stirred, not to rise, not to tower, but to shift slightly closer. And then it spoke, softly, like the voice of old bark in wind. "You are more than your work, more than what others measure you by. You are a keeper of silence, and that is no small thing." Borin swallowed thickly, then nodded once. The guardian's eyes slowly closed again, and the air returned to stillness. After a while, Borin rose. He placed one hand gently on the hilt of the sword, not to take it, but to thank it. Then he turned back toward the tunnel. The way was long, but the burden was light, and as he walked, he did not look back, because for the first time in his life, he knew he had left something in the world worth remembering. The naming. When Borin emerged from the deep tunnels, the sky had changed. It was night again, but a different night, the kind with wind on the air and stars so sharp they looked like hammered silver pressed into the sky. He paused just outside the lower shaft, placing his hand on the rock. "Thank you," he whispered to the stone, and for the first time in his life, he felt it answer, not in words, not in echo, but in stillness, the kind of stillness that says, "You were here, you mattered." Back in the forge, he didn't light the fire. He didn't need to. The sword was gone. Elioneth had faded. The blade now slept in the roots of the world. But Borin sat where he always had, on his old stool, hammer by his side, the hearth behind him dark but warm with memory. And then a voice, just one more, soft, kind, rooted not in mystery, but in knowing. You who carried what was never yours to keep. He looked around, but the forge remained still. You who listened when others would have spoken. He closed his eyes. You who stayed behind, not for glory, but to bear witness. Then you are called Borin the Rememberer. His breath caught, not because the name was grand, but because it fit. Not Borin the Brave, not Borin the Bold, just the one who listened, who watched, who carried the story when others could not. And as the wind passed through the cracks in the stone and the stars shifted overhead, Borin whispered something back. "Thank you." And the mountain was quiet, but not silent. The night of the stars. Borin stood outside the forge. He had brought no cloak, no tools, no lantern, just himself and the night. The stars above the blue mountains had rarely shone so clearly. They stretched across the sky like a river of silver. No clouds, no moon, just a light. He stood there for a long time, arms folded over his chest, letting the wind play through his beard. He thought of the sword, of Elioneth, of the chamber far below that now held both silence and peace. He did not feel sorrow. He felt settled, like a weight had been lifted, not from his shoulders, but from somewhere much deeper. By morning he would return to his carving, to the halls, to the simple sounds of stone on stone. He would not tell the story, not in the way others told tales around fires or in taverns, but he would carve it in patterns no one else would understand, in the tilt of an arch, in the spiral etched around a window frame, in the shape of a stair that led downward, just enough for someone curious to follow. The song would not be lost. Just quiet. As the stars turned slowly overhead, he whispered to no one in particular, "I'm still here." The wind shifted. It sounded for a moment like a single note from a sword that no longer sang, or perhaps it was only the breeze in the pines. But Borin smiled and sat down on the stone steps outside his forge and watched the stars until sleep took him. And so we end, not in fire, not in cold, but in quiet memory. The blade rests, the story remains, and deep beneath the mountain, the roots still remember.